Hey, Kines 320. So we've been looking at the cardiovascular anatomy and physiology last week, and this week we're going to step into acute responses to a singular bout of exercises. So when I say acute, what I'm talking about here is I'm talking about a singular bout of exercise. And I want to tell you about a little bit where I'm coming from, because that'll have everything to do with what we're talking about right now. So I'm actually in the group exercise room associated with the gym, where we do our research and clinical demonstration projects with older veterans and non-veterans. So most of our population is 65 years or older. And basically right now I am looking through some windows. I could be maskless because there's doors, and I can see all of the veterans that are exercising right now and observe an acute exercise bout. Now, for most of these veterans, they've been chronically exercising. All that to be said, that because of COVID-19, this is their first time back in almost a year, and they have an 8-week window to exercise with us until we bring another cohort of veterans in. And so we're trying, so while they're doing acute exercise and they were chronically exercising before, today we're going to talk about acute, and this week we're going to talk about acute responses to a singular exercise bout. So when I say acute exercise, I'm talking about a singular exercise bout. Okay, chronic exercise is when you put acute bouts of exercise together. We've talked about this. And then of course, prolonged or extended exercise is when an acute bout becomes long. So we'll talk more about that when we talk about the constructs of blood flow, etc. So I'm going to share my screen. This is going to be a relatively brief discussion, as we are going to just sort of get a general overview of what's going on in the cardiovascular system to sort of set the table for our future discussions about individual outcomes associated with changes during an acute bout of exercise. So let me share my screen and we'll get started in earnest. So let me put this in presentation mode and we will get started. So last week, we spent all of our time going over a very, very, very brief overview of the cardiovascular anatomy and physiology. The reality is you guys had a anatomy and physiology as a course, and so I'm not going to spend all of my time reviewing that. You need to know those structures, because if you don't understand the structures or their function, basically, then adapting it will be very hard. So over the next week, so March 7th through 12th, as we move towards spring break, we will be talking about acute cardiovascular responses to exercise. This is going to be a relatively brief module, but just an overview. So CV system changes during acute exercise. So on our first module last week, we talked about how the cardiovascular system must meet the demand of exercising or physical activity of muscles. Well, in this case, I'm adapting that only slightly to say each component of the cardiovascular system. So to get my pointer out here below, you'll note that these are the components. These components are going to come up not only now, but also when we talk about chronic adaptations as well. Each of these components must change the way it functions in order to meet the demand put on these increased demands of blood flow to exercising muscles. Because at the end of the day, what is the goal of the cardiovascular system? It is to be a delivery system of multiple things. And so over the next week, we're going to talk about acute changes to heart rate. We're going to talk about acute changes to stroke volume. We're going to talk about acute changes to cardiac output, blood pressure, blood flow, and the blood itself. So like I said before, this is going to be a relatively brief module, but to sort of give you an introduction to things, let's take these two graphs, and you'll be seeing more of these later. So changes in heart rate, stroke volume, and Q during exercise. I'm only going to demonstrate this with heart rate and stroke volume. We're going to talk more in depth about this later. And I'm not even going to explain these graphs at the moment, because we'll talk more about it. But I want to show you, if you look at the two graphs, you have either heart, so in graph A on the left, you have heartbeats, heart rate, and beats per minute on your y-axis. And on the graph on your right, you have stroke volume in milliliters per beat. So remember, that's a volume measure in a singular beat, all right? And we talked about this last set of modules, so you should have some familiarity of what these measurements are and do. So if you look at heart rate, again, pulling my pointer out here, You have heart rate in beats per minute. And when you're lying down, you can see that it can be anywhere below 60. Now, for some people, it's going to be above 60 and closer to 80. It's going to vary some from person to person or how well trained they are. This person, for instance, would be pretty well trained. And when someone sits up, assuming that you have normal orthostatic responses, heart rate should go up with it. And what I mean by orthostatic changes is when you go from lying to sitting or sitting to standing. Have you ever known someone that got dizzy during that period of time? Well, what's happening here oftentimes is that the demand is not meeting, or the blood flow is not meeting the demand. And most of that takes place in the function of your heart rate. Okay. And we'll see that based off of the graph on the right. So you can see that the changes are not particularly significant from lying to standing, but once you start walking and jogging and running, which you would expect, you have huge changes in heart rate and can have, and again, these are going to vary some too. We're going to take a really deep dive into heart rate in a little bit, but stroke volume, on the other hand, stroke volume starts at 90 milliliters per beat, but decreases with sit to stand. What's going on there? Why does that happen? We're going to talk more about it when we get to the stroke volume changes, but put this in the back of your mind. Why would we see increases in heart rate and decreases in stroke volume? All right. And then, of course, as we get into walking and jogging, all right, we see distinct increases in our stroke volume. So this is what I mean by acute changes. We're not going to talk much about this because we're going to talk about each of these in depth over the next few modules. But things that occur in the system must be met with the demand and changes in your cardiovascular system. And so what we're seeing here is that our body is in this constant homeostatic adjustment so that we can make sure that the demand is being met by the cardiovascular system. So again, I don't expect you guys to understand these graphs as it is right now, but I do want you to see at minimum that these changes are taking place, and those changes are taking place so that we can make sure that we're meeting the demand that's put on them. So as we move forward in the module, starting with heart rate and then moving on from there, we will discuss how these changes take place and what is going on and why our body does what it does. So stick with me. We'll talk next time about cardiovascular system changes in acute exercise and heart rate. I'll see you guys on the web. And if you have any questions, as always, please feel free to reach out. I hope you all are well, and we'll talk soon.